welcome to our Learning Community Talk with Kauser Razvi, who is the Senior Director of Performance and Innovation at College Now Greater Cleveland. She is also one of the reliable representatives from College Now for their Whole Child Action Accelerator project with us here at Seek Common Ground. Today, Kauser will talk about equitable design thinking, what sets it apart from traditional design thinking, and how to intentionally incorporate that practice into our work. So after Kauser's presentation, I'll have a brief interview with her, incorporating the questions you pose in the Zoom Q&A function. We're recording today's talk for folks to access on Slack. For those of you who are joining us live, you'll have access to the recording. And for those of you who are joining us only on the recording, welcome as well. Just by way of business, we have an upcoming talk a week from today, so August 26th, and that will be at 1 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, and that is with Francis Cox, who is a partner of ours with the Fratelli Group, public relations firm based in Washington, D.C. And Francis will be sharing traditional media outreach strategies with us. As I always note, please share your recommendations and suggestions for future talks, and we'll incorporate them. So let me tell you a little bit more about Kauser. So Kauser and her colleagues at College Now Greater Cleveland work to increase the post-secondary educational attainment goals of students through college and career advice, through financial aid counseling, and also through scholarship and retention services. When Seek Common Ground, when we were building out the Whole Child Action Accelerator, we interviewed each of the potential project operators. And during that interview, at that time, Kauser mentioned and outlined how the College Now team incorporates equitable design thinking into their workflows, and intentionally incorporated that into the project that they're doing through the Action Accelerator. So it was really just kismet for us to collaborate. And so we've asked her to share her experience, wisdom, and thinking on this work. And we hope that it'll be food for thought for you. And for some of you who already are veterans in this process, just some reinforcement about the practice. So finally, Kauser has generously offered her time for overtime. So this formal recorded presentation, part of our discussion, will end at the bottom of the hour. And after that, we'll have an informal discussion where you can come up as panelists, and we'll just have a dialogue for however long that lasts, so long as it does not go past the hour. So with all that said, I will now hand it over to you, Kauser.
Great. Thank you, Michael, and thanks for the whole Seek Common Ground team for letting me talk about this. I put a timer on because I really get passionate about this, and so I'll try to make sure that I also end so that we have time for questions. So as Michael mentioned, I'm going to talk about incorporating the equitable design principles in your programs, projects, planning, and design. One of the things that I wanted to start with, and that we have been trying here, is to think of COVID-19 pandemic as a springboard in a way to provide a yes and moment. I want to acknowledge that this time is traumatic. It's very difficult for a lot of people in a lot of different ways: parents, students, caregivers, anyone who's working in any industry has, we've all been affected. And so sometimes when we're in it, we can't really see the yes and moment. And in design thinking and equitable design thinking, they often mention that, like, hey, this is a potential. This is a space where maybe we can incorporate, ask, inquire, be curious about trying to do something different, right? It's the catalyst maybe that we needed to do something different. And you may have even heard that or be going through it personally, like, wow, I didn't like this career, so I'm changing, or I get to do a project that I've never done before. And so at college now, we really think about the pandemic as providing a yes and moment for us to do things that we've been talking about, do things differently, and then be more intentional, as Michael said, and incorporating these methods into our work. I'm going to go briefly over this design thinking mindsets. These are from the IDEO Design Thinking Toolkit. Design thinking has been around for a long time. It didn't start just with IDEO, so I just want to acknowledge that. And that's actually one of the principles that they talk about in equitable design thinking, is that we are all designers in some way, shape, or form, and we are designing all the time, and all of us have kind of creative talents. It just may manifest itself differently. But I do think that this slide is grounding because it does give us some ways of thinking, mindsets that we might need to have in order to have more equitable engagement and conversations. And so the first is that creative confidence. A lot of times our creative confidence is, sometimes it's just plain cut off. We don't have the opportunity to explore, to pivot, to change. And that really impacts the potential that we have. Empathy. Empathy is something that we all need. They're teaching it more in schools. They're teaching it in different ways. There's different ways to get empathy, but it's absolutely, absolutely critical to making social change stick. Embracing ambiguity. In the particular culture that we're in the United States, they don't like ambiguity, right? It's like right or wrong. Is it going to work? Is it not going to work? We have to be able to embrace ambiguity in order to be creative, making it. I make things all the time. I'm actually in my office. You see these Post-its behind me. If I did a thing of my wall, you'll see whiteboards, Post-its, examples. I have Play-Doh in here, all kinds of things where just tangibly trying to get an idea of things. Making it is really critical in the design world. Learning from failure, iterating, and optimism kind of all go together. They're mindsets that allow people to be their best creative selves because they know that they can add, change, iterate for making things better. And so these are some of the fundamental design thinking mindsets that if you have them, if you can cultivate them in your organization, you're going to build the innovation and improve performance and engagement that you want to have internally and hopefully externally with the people that you're working with. And all those mindsets come in this format. This is a format from Stanford Design School. They talk about empathizing, defining, ideating, prototyping, and testing. All of these are sort of discrete steps in a process, so sometimes the lines blur. And the process in the design method is that you really need to learn for whom you're designing. It could be observation, it could be interviews, surveys. There's lots of ways to get that, and I'll go through that in a slide in a second. And then actually defining what the problem is. One thing that's really important as practitioners in the social service field is we often think we know what the problem is, but sometimes it's not what we think it is, right? If someone said to me like, Kauser, what's your biggest problem? You're a single mom, you're a minority mom, you live in a poor city. They might have made assumptions about me. I'm a professional. I don't have maybe the same problems that my statistics might say, but I need a driver. That would actually be my biggest problem. I need help driving. So you can invest all the types of programs and invent all the types of programs that you might want. But if it's not that, maybe it's not helping. So we always have to be careful about the problem and who defines it, which is really critical when we talk about equitable design thinking. Who is defining the problem? From where is that coming from? And is it coming from the community? Brainstorming ideas, prototyping and testing. A lot of us have experience in that, but oftentimes it's cut short because we don't have, again, the resources or the buy-in from our organizations or community to actually take things through the full process. What the liberatory design is another word that is often used along with equitable design. There's slightly different frameworks. I'm going to go through both, but this one is one that is added to the Stanford design thinking framework, where they ask then, before you kind of go through these steps, that you notice and reflect, and you do that throughout. So the notice part and the reflection part are asking all of the time, who is at the table? Are the right people at the table? What is the history and context from which the person at the table is coming? Are the people at the table who are involved in this design process the people for whom we want to develop solutions with? Not for, but with whom we want to develop solutions, right? Are we allowing them enough voice to be able to participate in the design of the solution, product, service that is going to be available for the community? And so one of the changes that you'll see if you have been doing design thinking for a long time is the addition of this notice and reflect framework, or review, and a greater emphasis on empathize, to make sure that we are really, truly, not just a namesake, giving voice to the communities that we serve. This is an example from the Equity-Centered Community Design Field Guide. It's by the Creative Reaction Lab there in Missouri. You'll see here that they use a similar process of ideating, prototyping, testing, and learning. And those are kind of like at the bottom of this, the graphic. But in the center, they are using and grounding their work in a center of history, healing, and dismantling power constructs. When we talk about equitable design, this idea of where people are coming from, what is their history, are there traumas that we are dealing with, and acknowledging that is very, very important. In the last image I showed, I talked about notice and reflect as words that they are actually verbs that were being used as the design thinking practitioner, like, hey, we have to notice and reflect. Here we have acknowledge and dismantle. So there are 4 different words here, but they're really quite powerful, because what it means is that you're not just going to design your project with these, hey, typical design thinking steps, but what we're going to do is we are going to say, like, hey, we have to take a step back to understand where things are coming from, where people are coming from. Where is this policy coming from, right? Why is this service designed in this way? Are there power constructs that this particular policy, service, or product maintain that are not equitable or fair or humane to the people that we are serving? And so the idea is that we work on these issues with our communities, right? We don't do it in our office and then go into our communities. We do this work of noticing, reflecting, acknowledging, and thinking about these power constructs in community, so then that we may be able to better design with them. There's a huge element of bringing humility that has been also added to the design thinking language. And I think it's one of those feedback situations, I guess that's what I'll say, that oftentimes we've had consultants or designers come into projects where they're going to use design thinking with the idea, like, I am the designer, so I'll get your input and then I'll design something for you. With equitable design thinking, that's not the frame we want to have, right? We want to empower people with their creativity and know that they have ideas and solutions that they can design for their community, and have the humility of being able to learn and listen. And just, yes, we have some design skills or programming skills or management skills that can be additive to the process, but they are not mandating the process. So in that humility comes the work of empathizing and then defining. So the work that you have as a program manager, designer here is really to practice humility, active listening and seeing, staying curious, examining biases, and observing. These are all really difficult things, especially when we're time constrained. We have financial constraints. We have maybe even limits on how the project is defined, right? Like, we've had to put in a grant, or we've had to, we're using research that says X is happening. And then we have to go in and we have to make sure that we are looking kind of with those very new and curious eyes. And there's all kinds of work that we can do to practice these particular methods. And I can share those at another time or via the Slack, but things like journey mapping, which is a process of asking someone, well, not only like how they do that, but like what effect does it have on them emotionally? What are the high and low points? Work of character profiling in the sense of, well, what do people see, hear, and think? Just because you see them in an environment doesn't necessarily you know what they're saying, because you haven't listened to what they say, or there's no chance for them to actually give you particular feedback. And so we have to really work really hard on kind of being grounded and saying, yes, I do know some things, but I don't know everything. I'm here to learn. I'm here to be curious. And then to use other materials. One thing that comes up, as Michael mentioned, I work at an organization around college access. So one thing we often talk about is, what we read. What are our sources of information? Because that helps us examine our biases. It helps us look at how things are constructed, and it provides us different points of view. So you can learn outside of your particular project and community as well, and make sure that you're bringing different points of view. All of these help with the define stage. And as I mentioned quickly earlier, what we want to do is make sure that we haven't defined the problem before we walk in, because then we usually set ourselves and our communities up for failure. We might have an understanding of what the problem might be, but the work of empathizing is to help us better define that and have our community help us define that problem, issue, concern, as much from their point of view as possible. So I just have some tips here to, you want to be with your community, observe, but also become inspired. That's another thing. I think if you're in the field a long time or you've done a lot of projects, you sometimes become jaded. Like, I've seen this before, right? So where can you find inspiration in what you're looking for? At college now, we've done a lot of projects. Here's a huge set of sample kind of graphics where we try to apply this equitable design thinking in everything we did. At the bottom right, it might be your left, is a picture of a bus. During COVID, we couldn't get into schools. We said, well, let's just get this bus that had Wi-Fi on it and go outside and get people access. It was a way of saying, hey, people are telling us, I want these services. I don't know where to go. I can't go inside. Our advisors saying, we want to help. We can't get into schools. What can we do? And then also making sure that not everyone could get to us during COVID. So how could we be with them? Other things were virtual college tours. You'll see up on the top, it says through the lens, a virtual panel discussion. We tried to bring in the voices of other members of our community here in Cleveland that haven't really been highlighted or heard, so that we could better hear what their points of view were and share that with our larger community. I'm just cognizant of time too, so I'm going through relatively quickly. In the project that we're doing with Seek Common Ground, we interviewed parents and talked to them about, well, what concerns and issues did they have in regards to going back to school post-COVID? What are the impacts that they have now from the COVID time period that have impacted their thoughts as well as their students' thinking around the future in college and career? And what we did was, you'll see that picture on the, it's my bottom left, it might be your bottom right, with the little colored squares, was a form of them kind of talking about their history, their experience during the COVID process, what anchored them, what supported them, what was a risk to them, why were those risk factors? And really got an understanding and grounding of where the community was coming from and what was important to them to kind of sail out of it, which is, there's a little image of a sailboat. And then you'll see these handwritten things or things that they designed to say like, oh man, maybe we need to, design these conversation cards to have with our students. It would be great if we kind of like had a map of the city of like things that we could do to re-engage them in making good life choices. And we're going to continue to work with these parents. They were very, very engaged. Another thing that we did in this particular workshop related to the equitable design is have them spend time acknowledging the histories in their communities. So many of them talked about the issue of like, well, our community fabric isn't the same because of foreclosure, because there isn't the same network of knowing your neighbors, because our kids don't go to the neighborhood school, because of gentrification in some cases. And so all of these factors really impacted, and having the discussion around those factors impacted their ideas on what was needed and what they kind of like wanted to see from us in this project. And so it was really, really very powerful to take that step back from just saying like, okay, let's think about what your issues are. Let's brainstorm some ideas and what this might look like. We had to take that pause, be inclusive to like where they were coming from in the city, what their neighborhoods look like now and concerns they had. And then use that in our conversations. And they both mentioned that it was powerful for them, but it was also powerful for us as facilitators of that session. Oh, I went a little faster than I thought. So I will turn it back over to Michael because I was so worried about time. I went through the.
That was great. That was really neat.
I hope that was helpful.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I learned so much from just that brief discussion. I do want to share with folks that your full presentation. This was your presentation deck, but there's a more comprehensive slide deck that Kauser shared with us as well, and that'll be available for people to access on Slack. And so it there's more detail on some of the principles that Kauser touched upon. I have a couple questions, and please, if there are any questions from the audience, and I'm going to incorporate Ingrid Stegmiller's question into mine, which is, in reflecting on this work, because how is this shift or this approach benefited the work that you do, and how has it changed your practice? Like, how has it both benefited your sort of job, and how has it changed you?
So that's a great question. So first I'm going to start with the latter part, which is how it changed me. So I mentioned a couple of times, like during the conversation, like no matter how much you think you've been doing this, there's always things that you can kind of learn and adjust and change. And I highlighted those particular verbs of like notice, reflect, right? Empower, dismantle, by rethinking my design thinking steps to incorporate those verbs. It made me stop and pause. And when you stop and pause to say like, oh, wow, did I really examine the power structures that are at play here when I'm asking parents about financial aid, or we're designing a financial aid workshop? Like, we really haven't given them space to articulate their issues with, wealth accumulation and debt, concerns about debt, impact of debt on their communities, the fact that there are check cashing stations in their communities and not necessarily banks, so they don't necessarily have a great relationship sometimes. And when you use those verbs that the equitable design or liberatory design framework pose, it makes you kind of say, okay, there are some other things that are going on here that we need to give space for, or even if they're not mentioned by people, then what space am I giving to kind of like acknowledge that they exist? And you'd be so surprised, like people know their history, they know their context, they know the trauma, they know generational impacts of that, and they aren't often given space to articulate it. And so I think that's had the biggest impact on me, is like just saying, okay, let me remember these verbs and let me make sure that my process incorporates an activity for this, a point of reflection. And I've done it in the workshop we did for this grant and other places. Sometimes it's self-reflection, that manifests itself then in group work. Sometimes it's group reflection that then other people acknowledge and affirm, and that creates both a safe space and the idea like, hey, we're in this together, and so I'm going to help co-create the next step with you. I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, yeah. I think that covers kind of both.
Yeah. Okay.
Within it, and so I'm going to actually go to sort of my take on Ingrid's question. Is like, how do you leap in and how do you get started with this? And my sort of gloss on it is, how do you case make for this within an organization like college? Now, how do you convince people that this is a valuable process in which to engage?
Right. Some people, if you like manage organizations, are not going to like my answer. But most of the time what I do is try to do like stealth initiation of this type of work, especially if you can't get like, hey, this is the framework. I think we should do all our projects in this way. And so what I mean by that is, if you do look through the literature on equitable design practice or design thinking practice, it might be the incorporation of like in a team meeting at first in your own organization, like, can we have like a reflective practice on X? It could be, for example, changing survey questions if your organization always puts a survey out. To look a little bit differently, to say like, are we asking not just about the service, but the impact on the person? Or are we asking about questions of interaction, like the human portions of the service or product, not just that. Another way I do it all the time is I usually say like, that's great information. I think we might need a little more information. Could we do this activity? And then I'll incorporate like journey mapping or character mapping that allow, for example, more insight or more interaction. And then people usually love those particular activities. And they're like, oh my gosh, I learned so much from that session. Could we do more? I totally understand that it's very hard to say like, okay, we need 6 hours to do a design workshop, or we need 3 days to do a design workshop to do this with fidelity. But there are things that you can do that aren't bastardizing the intention or the process, that you can still do with fidelity and get good results. Some of the things that are subtle, for example, like are on brainstorming, is where people will say, well, let's brainstorm and just everyone popcorn out ideas and I'll write them on the white paper. That doesn't support people who are introverted, nor does it address the power dynamics of like, well, Michael's my boss, and so I already know he doesn't like this idea. But tiny ways of everyone put one idea on a Post-it, and then let's put all the Post-its up there and group them. That's an actual method in the design thinking process. It's a way of deconstructing power that's very subtle, but it can have big impact. And most organizations brainstorm for some things or another. And so there are ways that you can kind of think about these principles and incorporate them in your everyday work.
Closing question. Tell us about someone who's influenced you.
Oh my gosh. Well, I usually say that it's my family, like in general. I come from a really big family. My parents were immigrants. And so it's sort of like that collective, because it seemed like we were just one mass, not necessarily particular individuals, but I am very inspired. I have cousins who are novelists. I have cousins who teach the Facing History type curriculum about being upstandards. My sister's a filmmaker, another one's a doctor. One runs, is the CEO of a sustainable apparel coalition to help make sustainability and the clothes you wear in organizations. So I'm pretty inspired by like kind of the organism of my family, and sort of the uplifting message that I get from them, which is, like we always seem to have each other's back, so someone needs something, there's always a sister or a cousin or an aunt or an uncle who show up. And so because it's the community I came from, it's the community that I want to create, and not to say like but it's a big reason why I'm such a fan and proponent of doing these types of equitable design and using these equitable design practices, because I think that's the type of community it creates.
Thank you for this tremendously informative introduction. And we just want to know there's so much more information in Kauser's full presentation, including the exercises that she just noted in her prior comments. So really, thank you again. We'll look forward to seeing you all next week on our talk with Francis Cox. And if you can, please stay on for overtime.